Hi, everyone, and welcome to Get Hired Live. I'm your host, Andrew Seaman, LinkedIn's Senior News Editor for Job Searches and Careers. As always, I want to kick off the show by asking you to introduce yourself in the comments. Tell us a little about yourself, your name, where you're from, and a little bit about your job search or what you want to do in your career. And then once you do that, I want you to connect with each other. So maybe you see someone who works in the industry that you want to work in. Maybe they work in the industry that you work in, that you're trying to find a job, or maybe they work in part of the world where you want to work. Make those connections, reach out. Some of the best messages that I get after the show are from people who say that they met during the show and they end up job searching together. It's a really great way to network, and networking is the cornerstone of a successful job search. So why not start right now? And I want to say hi to some of the people who are introducing themselves into the comments already. We have Susan from Dallas, Noreen from Los Angeles, Sikandar from Pakistan, Jeffrey from Florida, Nancy from New Jersey, Kathy from Manchester, Faith from Turkey, Will from Syracuse, Stephen from New York City, where I am, Patrick from North Carolina, Nara from Dubai, and Samarat from India. So welcome to all of you. Keep introducing yourself in the comments. Like I said, network. And then also tell us your job search questions, because we have such a wonderful expert on the show today. We're going to be talking about job interviews first, but we're going to also be taking your questions. So make sure you get those questions in. We'll be paying attention to them and getting those just in a bit. So without further ado, I want to welcome our expert onto the screen. Her name is Sarah Johnston. She is the founder of Briefcase Coach, and she is, I think, the person who's been on Get Hired Live the most, and she has over 1 million followers on LinkedIn. She's incredible. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me, Andrew. I'm so excited to talk to you guys today.
Yes, well, thank you for coming on the show. And really, the way I think we met was because you are an interview coach. That is sort of one of your specialties, but you're a job search coach, you're a strategist, you help people really throughout their job search. But one thing you really like is helping people with job interviews. So, people, there's a few different ways that people approach interviews. Probably the worst one is they just show up without any preparation. So why should people prep for a job interview?
Yeah. Well, you only get often one chance to make a first impression. And I have worked with job seekers for years as a former corporate recruiter and now as an interview strategist. And the thing that people tell me is that they've never regretted over preparing, but they often have deep regret over their lack of preparation. In fact, I did a poll on LinkedIn back in July of 2020, and I asked people to tell me how much time that they typically spend preparing for an interview. And 19% of people told me that they winged it or they spent under an hour preparing for an interview. Most of my clients, my executive clients or clients who are wanting to really level up in their career, often spend 10 hours or more preparing for that one interview. So if you think about what your competition is doing, you want to spend the time preparing so that you stand out.
That's really great to know, especially the time they spend on it. And I think for a lot of the people that you work with, something that's important to note too, is that these are people who are focusing on the quality of their job applications and quality of their search and not necessarily quantity, right? So these are people who they want a job at that company or they want that specific job, right?
Right. They have an opportunity to interview for what is a dream role or position that is really in line with their skill set. They didn't just apply for 100 jobs online and just kind of see what stuck. They were really focused in their job search strategy.
Yes, the spray and pray method, as a lot of people call it, where you just send out a bunch of applications and hope for the best. Before we get to the next question, I do want to say hi to a lot of the people who are introducing themselves again in the comments. And we have people from all over the world. We have Kim from Las Vegas, Kelly from Wisconsin, Kathy from Phoenix, Elisa from Florida, Nicole from North Dakota, Guy from Oregon, Ruth from Oklahoma, Paul from Philadelphia, Alan from Indiana, Gwen from Canada, Janelle from Texas, Rob from Massachusetts, and Amit from Seattle. So welcome to everyone. And tell us if you've ever had sort of a bad job interview experience. It'd be great to hear maybe some specific issues that have popped up for people. So tell us in the comments about that. But Sarah, for people who they are saying, okay, well, I'm going to prep for a job interview, but how do I do that? What specifically should they be doing, and how much time should they spend on a job interview that's not at executive level, but maybe mid-career or mid-level?
Sure. So for someone mid-level who wants to have a targeted interview prep time, I would prepare to spend between 5 and 10 hours preparing for your interview. So the very first thing that I would do is I would get out the job description, and I would actually read every line of the job description and prepare an example of a time you did something that fits with every line of the job description. So I just, searched on LinkedIn right before this time for an example job description so that I could give you an example on the call. But I'm looking at a job recruiter role. And one of the requirements for the recruiter role is that they want someone who can implement effective recruitment strategies, metrics, quantitative and qualitative, and activity tracking. So if you see a line like that in your job description, you want to think of an example of a time that you did this so you can speak to that in the interview. The job description can be really your kind of code or your roadmap for the interview. The next thing I would do if I were interviewing for a role is I would go online and I would do research on the people that are interviewing you. Go to their LinkedIn page, see any public facing articles about that individual, if they've been on any podcasts, familiarize yourself with their content. You want to think before you walk into the meeting about 1 or 2 ways that you can make small talk with that person, either virtually or in person. And the reason I say that is a lot of times, and I think that number is around 60% of people have made a decision about a candidate in the first 5 minutes of a meeting. So you want to think about the fact that that first 5 minutes of a meeting is often the kind of pre-interview conversation, the small talk, and then the tell me about yourself. And then the next thing that you want to do as you're preparing for your interview is to think about your star stories and practice star stories. LinkedIn rolled out about a year ago this wonderful feature for premium members. And I promise that, they didn't tell me to say this. I think it's an absolutely fantastic feature where you can see an interview question. You can hear examples from professionals, from career experts on how to answer that question. And then you can actually practice and record yourself saying that answer and watch it back. I would absolutely encourage you to take the time to practice those really common interview questions and hear yourself giving your answers so you can listen and refine your answers. A strong interview response is usually around 60 seconds to 2.5 minutes. So make sure your responses are shorter than 3 minutes long. And then finally, you want to do some company research as well. You want to go on the company about page. You want to look at their corporate values, what they stand for, and figure out how you personally connect with those corporate values. And then also go and Google the company and see if you can find any new information about what they're working on so that you can ask thoughtful questions during your interview that show that you're genuinely interested in the opportunity.
I think that's really good advice. And, we have some people here who are sharing their stories about job interviews. And we have one, Paul, who said he has his first job interview since receiving his MBA on Tuesday and preparing it over the weekend for the role in aerospace defense. And looks like he's taking your advice, spending 10 or more hours on it and looking to align my purpose and the company that I am meeting. So hopefully it sounds like he's on the right track. And we have a comment here from Crystal, and this is one of those sort of maybe job interviews gone wrong, where she said, I had an interview with a panel of 10 people that instantly made me super nervous and I was passed over for the job. 10 people sound like a lot for an interview. So I'm sorry that happened to you, Crystal. But Sarah, what do you think is your advice for people who, maybe they walk in and there's unexpected people in the room, or maybe more people than they anticipated?
Yeah. I'm sorry, Crystal. I'm an extrovert and I thrive off energy from people, but I think 10 people would make me nervous too. But if you could go back and do that again, I would focus on trying to make a small connection with each person. And so if I were in your shoes and you were doing that interview again, I would, write down every person's name as they're introducing themselves so that you can then kind of remember who they are and direct them by name, kind of going through that Dale Carnegie book. People love to hear their name and love to be remembered. And that's the same for people interviewing you. They want to see how you can serve their pain point. And every single person in the meeting and in the interview with you has their own pain point and way that they're going to connect or work with that you in that individual role. So focus on trying to make an individual connection with each person, and then just take a deep breath and do the best you can. 10 people is a lot.
Yeah, and I think the book you're referencing is How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie, which I believe, next to the Bible, maybe one of the most sold books in history. I think it's maybe from the 50s or 60s, even earlier maybe. I have a copy, and it is literally one of the best sold books of all time. So it's How to Win Friends and Influence People. And I think it apparently works because it's very popular. But Sarah, you mentioned something earlier where you said, don't spend necessarily an hour prepping for an interview, but sometimes people, they don't have the luxury of spending a lot of time on interview prep. Maybe they have a long job that they have to dedicate some of their time to jobs, or maybe, it's a last minute interview where they got to call and say, hey, can you meet this afternoon? So for someone who only has like an hour or so to prep for an interview, how should they maximize their time and increase their odds of success?
It's a great question. I'd focus on three things. The first thing that I would focus on, if I were in your shoes with an hour to prepare for an interview, I would read the job description, familiarize yourself with the role, and know how your strengths can connect with the pain points of that opportunity and be able to speak to that. The second thing that I would do is just going back to that research that I shared earlier, that around 60% of hiring managers have made a decision based in the first 5 minutes of an interview. So you want to focus on prepping for that first 5 minutes. So the small talk, making a connection, and then nailing your tell me about yourself question. So if you haven't practiced tell me about yourself, that hour would be well spent if you work on sharing and practicing your answer and connecting who you are with the pain points of that role. And then the final third thing that I would do is start thinking about the most popular questions that you're likely to get in an interview. And those questions can be your strengths and weaknesses, nailing your story of why you're looking for a change or why you're looking for a transition. As a former corporate recruiter, I've seen a lot of people misstep in answering that transition question, and there's often red flags for candidates when answering that question. So make sure that you practice that response. And then finally, you want to kind of tie your stories back to that job description and your pain point. So just making sure that you're clear on your unique value proposition.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And one last follow-up for me is thank you notes. Yes, no, after an interview?
I still say yes, even though times have changed. I used to be a big fan of written thank you notes on nice stationery. And now that we're in this work from home virtual setting, an email is just perfectly fine. And often, a lot of times, people are making decisions fairly quickly on whether or not they're going to pass on a candidate that you may interview at 9 a.m. and by 2 p.m. they've already decided whether or not they're going to, extend a second round interview to you. So an interview is fast. They'll receive it right away. And it's a great way to just reinforce that you want the role, that you're passionate about the opportunity, and remind them of why you're uniquely qualified.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And, we still have people sharing sort of their horror stories from job interviews. And Janelle says, I spent 6 hours preparing for my most recent interview. The HR department did not communicate anything after, saying that I had the skills and experience they desired. So it's always bad when they don't follow up, and it's usually a good sign of the culture. Simram, this is a good tip. It sounds like said I watched some fireside chats of the CEO of the company I was interviewing for and quoted them during my interview. And then,
great.
Yeah. And then there was one here about interviewing in a room the size of the closet, which is never comfortable. But they didn't get the job, but they're okay with it, it sounds like. So let's take some questions. And this one is really interesting. So the first thing I should say before we get to the question is that this deals with like a legal issue. So there are obviously certain things that are sensitive questions that may put an employer in a legally sensitive area. One of the things you need to know, at least in the US, is that it's very difficult to prove discrimination during the hiring process. So one of the common myths is if someone during an interview asks your age, a lot of people think that's completely off limits, but it's not. What is off limits is them using that information during the hiring decision. So they can ask you your age typically, but they can't use it as part of the should we hire this person discussion. And in this case, we have a question here that basically says from Ediana, and they say, I had someone ask me if I was planning on having kids and I felt caught off guard. What is the best way to respond to an inappropriate question in a job interview? And that's from Ediana. And again, there's sort of a legal aspect to this, but it's also good to know how to respond in the moment.
Well, first of all, hi, Ediana. I am a fan of your content on LinkedIn and really enjoy reading what you write. With these tricky legal questions, if you're witty and you can, snap back with something witty, then I think making light of the question and turning it around is often a great solution. I'm not that quick on my feet. I'm not that funny. So I would probably be like you and would probably feel a little bit uncomfortable answering that question. But in this case, I think being direct is so important because you want to work for an employer that values you and values your opinions. And if they're stepping in a place that's not comfortable, then you should let them know. So if I were getting this question in an interview, I would say something along the lines of, I find that to be an inappropriate question. And this is something between my partner and I. And then would just pause there and let them redirect the question. And they may find that they accidentally asked that question. Often recruiters or hiring managers will just get in a situation where they're talking and then, word vomit, they accidentally ask something that they quickly realize that they shouldn't have asked. And so it may have been a slip of the tongue on their end and not a question that they meant to ask you.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, is that, especially if they're talking about their children or something like that, and they just think it's more of a conversation, it may slip. Or if the person isn't really traditionally in a hiring role and they're just sort of in on the interview, I think those sometimes often happen. We have a question from Gwen, and I think this is really good. Most places have 3 or 4 interview rounds. What's most important at each interview stage? So sort of as you prep for each of those interviews, are there things that you do differently, or what should you do to succeed at those various interviews?
I love this question. It comes down to you have to know what matters to every single person that you're interviewing with. So for the recruiter, that maybe who's the gatekeeper in this role, there's certain things that matter to that person. Same with the manager, same with their boss. And so you've got to figure out what matters to that person. For your manager, they may be more concerned with you being able to work autonomously. They may be more concerned with the way that you like to be managed. And so the questions that you ask to your manager may be very different than the questions that you'll ask to the recruiter. With someone who may be your superior or your boss, things that may be impressive to them may be your strategy, how promotable you are, where you could complement the team. When you're looking for kind of clues to figure out what matters to an individual, LinkedIn can be a great tool. You can go on their profile and find out about their previous work history, potential projects that they worked on, if they've shared that. I also like to look at recommendations that they've given to people in the past. That's something that's often overlooked. But if you go down and look at recommendations, you can see what they value in the way that they describe people. So take a look at recommendations that they've given and use that as potential clues to what they care about.
Yes, a very good point. And then, like you said, sort of keep looking through their profile. If they have social media accounts, you can see what they're reading, what they like to read. And those are all pretty good touch points to say, hey, maybe there's some commonality there, or I can discuss this or that. So I think that's a really good point. And we have a question here that I think is really interesting. And I think maybe a lot of people feel like this sometimes. Kyle said that he knows someone who was interviewing 10 times for the same position at the same company. How many interviews is too many?
Oh. I guess it kind of goes down to how badly do you want the job? If you really want to work there, I suppose you'll jump through 10 interview hoops. And if you really don't want to work there, then you'll draw the line and say, I can't continue preparing. I can't continue to take off of work to make it to 10 interviews. So in some cases, it comes down to how badly do you want it and how much can you convey that. The other thing that I would recommend doing is just be transparent with the recruiter. The recruiter is your connection to the organization. So you can go to the recruiter and say, listen, I really want this job. I really want to work here. But every time I interview, I'm having to, secure childcare or take off work or, spend, whatever preparing. Can you let me know what this process is going to look like? What's the end goal? When are you thinking that you guys are going to make a decision? And just get them to be clear on the expectations and the timeline with you.
Yeah, I think that is key. Like you said, reach out to the recruiter, and really they should be your guide, especially if you're 10 interviews in. You are at the top of the list of possible people that they're going to pick. I would hope so. So the recruiter should be really helpful at that point to say, okay, here's what the rest of the process is going to look like, because I can't imagine that they're going to put that much effort into someone that they don't want. Or if they do, that's a very inefficient company, I think. And we have a question here from Karen that's interesting. And she asked, what if there's no job description to go by? I've been looking at companies to see what descriptions they have under similar roles. I'm hoping this will help prepare me for this interview. What do you think? And this could be maybe there's internal or something like that, but what if there's not necessarily a listed job description?
Karen, I think what you're doing is a smart move at looking at comparable job descriptions. But before you take a job, I think you should always ask for something written so you can have it as a measure of what you need to accomplish in the role. So it's in your best interest before you move forward to actually have a job description for yourself. But what you're doing is great. You can also interview internal people if it's an internal role to see what the pain points are. If you have friends or connections that are on the inside, maybe they can give you clues as to what the role entails. Or you may be in a situation where you could meet with the hiring manager. You guys could have a great first connection, and they may have some areas that this position needs to accomplish, but you could also help drive the job description and give them input into what you want. But again, I would get everything on paper before you accept a role.
Yeah, and it would be okay to sort of reach out to the recruiter and say, hey, do you have a written job description? Because usually internally they have to have a job description written, usually, right?
They have to. I guess the exception would be if it's a small business and maybe they don't have an HR function, or it's an entrepreneur who's just creating something and they have a need for someone, but they don't know who they need yet. So I can see there being some small exceptions, but for you need something on paper.
Yes, the famous startup chief fun officer. I'm sure there's got to be a chief fun officer somewhere. Another question that I think is really interesting is from Paul. What do you feel about lengthy skill assignments and new AI-based one-way interviews? So I think there's two questions in there. There's a lot of companies that may ask you to do assignments ahead of time, and then there's also these new interviews where you basically are interviewed by a computer.
Yeah. So you asked for my opinion. I'll share my opinion. I'm with you as a candidate. I do not like video interviews. I think that they're bad for the candidate experience. It's really hard to make that personal connection with the organization. So, I hear that a lot of times candidates dislike them. But as I'm reading and as I'm learning, 86% of companies are doing virtual hiring right now. Significant number of companies are introducing these one-way virtual interviewing platforms. And one of the main providers of this service is HireVue. So I'm sure you're going to hear that name, and you'll probably hear that name more often. But as the reason that they do this, and I actually asked some recruiter contacts of mine just for their insights into why they do this. And there's this wonderful recruiter group called Recruiting Brain brain food, and it's run by Hung Lee. And these one-way video interviews are great for roles where there's high attrition or high volume, and it's a great way for the company to get to that second round interview faster. For people who are preparing for these interviews for the very first time, I'd absolutely recommend that you go on LinkedIn to that premium feature and start practicing the video one-way interview that tool allows. The tool gives you about 3 minutes to record, and often these video interviews for these platforms give you 3 minutes to answer your response. So the beauty of these one-way interviews is that you can absolutely prepare, and often they're asking the same questions. Tell me about yourself, strengths and weakness, why do you want this role? So you can practice those questions and know that you're going to do a great job. The other thing that I would recommend is, even though you're not making a human connection with the video interview, find a way to make a connection to someone on the inside. So maybe that's you send a personal note to the hiring manager via LinkedIn or through email and just let them know how much you appreciate the opportunity to interview. Or even better, find a way to get a referral. So know someone in your network who can tell the hiring manager that you're doing a video interview and that you're applying and that you're a strong candidate and that they should consider you.
Yeah. And what about, and we have a question here from Blaze, aptitude and personality test, that I know that they've been a big topic of discussion.
As a strengths finder coach, I love aptitude and personality tests because I think that they can give the hiring manager a lot of insights into how you work and your strengths and how to play up those strengths. As a candidate, I think it's a great idea for you to take those assessments on your own. And Gallup will allow you to take the Strengths Finder test by yourself without working with a coach for $19.99. Knowing yourself and knowing your strengths and being able to articulate those in an interview are really, really beneficial. And so if you're intimidated by these assessments, just make sure that you are clear on what the pain points are of the opportunity, and then know yourself, know your strengths, and be able to tie your strengths to that job. And so if they're asking you to take these assessments, just you personally be able to clearly articulate your value to the hiring manager as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So make sure that even if you have to take an aptitude test or a personality test, that you're also communicating with the human on the other side, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Got it. And we have a question here from Cameron who asks, when changing a career completely, how can I explain this to the company? So I think a lot of people get this when they say, I want to pivot, I want to do something new. And then you find yourself in front of someone who says, why this? Why now? So what would the best response be, or how should you prepare a response?
Without knowing your individual situation, Cameron, it's hard to give kind of a one-size-fits-all answer. But the clear thing that I would do if I were you is I would know yourself well. So go back to that assessment, that Strengths Finder, or poll your friends and ask them for your values and what makes you good at what you do, and be able to connect what you want to, who you are with that end goal, the transferable skills. So going back to that recruiter example earlier, say you've been a recruiter, but now you want to work in nonprofit. What did you do well as a recruiter that would translate to being a nonprofit exec or fundraiser or coordinator? So be able to connect the dots for the other person. And then the other thing is just be confident in your answer. A lot of times when I'm working with people who are making a career change, they're wishy-washy and they say things like, well, I could do this, or I could do this, or maybe this. Be confident in what you want to do and clearly just explain that to people. And the other thing that I would lastly say is don't be afraid of asking people for advice on how to make that transition. A lot of times when I've worked with job seekers, people who know you really well can see that. They can see those strengths, and they can see how you would be great at that. And they may know the right person in their network who can help you land that job or make that transition. So don't be afraid of asking your friends for advice on how to make that transition.
Yeah, no, that's really good advice. And we have a question from Christine, and I've heard this a few times, and Christine asked, any insight on job descriptions that are not really what the job entails? So maybe you read a job description and you say, hey, this is great. And then you get in there and you're like, this isn't really what I thought it would be. What should you do in those situations?
I love this question because I have totally been there. I think the key is making sure that in every single interview, you're actually assessing the role yourself and taking questions with you to the interview and examining the opportunity. Because a lot of people take the job description at face value, or they go in and they are so focused on impressing the other person that they don't take the step back and assess the opportunity. So if you're kind of getting the sense in the interview that it's not what you thought it was, maybe a good follow-up question would be, talk to me about the KPIs for this role. How will this position be measured? What will make this a strong candidate? What's successful? And so asking questions like that will help you get to the root of what they're looking for and how they're going to measure the role.
Yes. And speaking, this is also job interview related. So I'm trying to stick with the theme a little bit. Melissa says, when is too soon to follow up after an interview if you've had no feedback? And this goes back to sort of the point someone made earlier of interviewing, being told, hey, you meet all the qualifications, and then just not hearing back. So for Melissa, when should you follow up?
I think it's a great idea every single time that you're interviewing to ask as a follow-up in the interview. So this was a great meeting. Thank you for your time. Just out of curiosity, what's the next step? When should I hear from you? So in the meeting, you're hearing the other person, whether it's the recruiter or the hiring manager, verbalize to you the next step and when you should expect to hear back. So they may say that they've got a round of interviews and they're going to be wrapping up by 7 days from now. Put that day in your calendar. And then if you haven't heard from them by day 8 or day 9, that would probably be a great time to send a follow-up note. And hopefully you'll hear back from the person once you send that email. If you don't, maybe you wait 5 business days and then you send a follow-up note at that point. I think 2 follow-up notes is really the sweet spot.
Got it. And that doesn't include the thank you note. So after the interview, yeah. And what about, and this is just my own curiosity, after an interview, are you pro or con connecting with people that you interviewed with to say sort of like, hey, it was great meeting you today. I would love to make you part of my network?
I'm very pro. I say follow up, connect with them on LinkedIn. And just kind of as a personal story, early in my career, I interviewed for a role with a company, and it was a company I really wanted to work for. And I actually got rejected from the job. They did not hire me. They went with another candidate. I stayed connected with those individuals and continued to see them out in the community at community events, and didn't avoid them. I still remained connected on a professional level with them. And then a year later, when there was an opportunity that opened up, they actually reached out to me, and it was a more senior level role than what I'd initially applied for, but they remembered me and we had maintained a relationship. So don't shy away from connecting with people. And another thing that you can do to continue to engage them after the interview, even if you weren't, you didn't move along in the job, is to stay connected through the comment section. So if they're posting on LinkedIn, you can engage with their posts on occasion and give thoughtful responses or ideas in their post. And that's just a way to stay top of mind.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Even I remember, interviewing for a job many, many years ago, and it just, the salary and sort of what I needed didn't match up. So it was during basically the hiring process where I said, I don't want to waste your time. I'm going to have to bow out. And there were literally 2 other times after that where I got an email from someone saying, hey, we think you'd be great for this job. And Bob, who was like the hiring manager for that job that didn't work out, actually recommended they come to me.
Wow.
So, we stayed in touch a little bit after that. And it paid, even though none of those jobs I ever accepted, it was great to know that, he still thought of me and sort of got my name out there. So it can really pay dividends in the future to keep expanding your network.
I love it. And that happens all the time.
Yeah. And I think, this is a good question to end on from Andy. In your opinion, what is the most common mistake made during an interview?
There's so many common mistakes, but the most common mistake that I see people make is that they give one-size-fits-all answers, and they don't differentiate themselves in a way that shows that they really want the job. And I'll expand on this a little bit. So a really prepared job seeker is going to prepare an answer for a question for different interviews. So maybe you get, tell me about yourself in every single interview, but you tweak the answer just a little bit depending on who you're talking to really show that you know who they are and that you can meet their pain points and that you're aligning yourself with that opportunity. Same with, answering questions like, where do you see yourself in 5 years? You want to make sure that your answer to that question is honest and truthful, but still in line with the opportunity. I've mentioned before that I'm a former corporate recruiter, and I can't tell you how many times I presented a candidate who I thought looked fantastic on paper. And then at the end of, the hiring manager meeting with the candidate, I went to their office just to check in and see how things went. And they said, Sarah, I liked the candidate, but I just didn't feel like they wanted the job, or they didn't convey enough passion for this opportunity for me. And the thing is hiring managers, right now in this market are getting a lot of applicants for every role, and they want to hire someone that really wants to be there and will absolutely take and run with the position. So you've got to convey that passion for the opportunity and that you align yourself with their pain points.
Yes, I think that is such a great point to make, because when people ask me and, friends and family, they say, I'm going in for this job interview, or I have sort of a nibble at this position. What can I do to really nail this interview? I always say, tell them you want the job. And they look at me like I'm crazy. And I always say, no, but you don't understand. I said, people go in there and they think there's some value to sort of playing hard to get. And really, they want someone who's excited to work there, who says, I'm really passionate about this, that I'm passionate about the company's mission. Yes, there are jobs that, are not that fun to be in. But if you're interviewing for a job that's part of your career that you really want to grow in, they want someone who says, like, listen, I want this job. And, and a lot of times I'll hear back from people who say, that was a really good thing to know, because they really commented on my passion or whatever. So I think that whole idea of like showing that you actually want the job is quite important.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Sarah. And, I hope people, were watching at the bottom of the screen, because we've been flashing your LinkedIn URL.
Well, great. I'm so glad. And I wanted to mention as well, there's a new course that I've released through LinkedIn Learning on interviewing. So I hope that if people want to continue learning about interview prep, that they'll check out the course as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you, for always being a wonderful guest and friend to Get Hired. So, yes.
Thank you for the opportunity. Great to meet you guys.
Yes, and thank you all for watching and tuning in. And we will be back on Friday with another episode of Get Hired Live. I will be speaking with Niatu Benshi-Enschel, who is the founder of Avenir Careers. My French is not that good. Avenir is a French word. But that is Friday, August 20th at 11 a.m. So tune in. We'll be talking about protecting your mental health during a job search, and of course, answering your job search questions. But don't worry, because we also keep the LinkedIn news page, which is where you're watching this show right now, stocked with content. And on Monday, we have another very special and very important show with my colleague, Nina Melendez, and she will be joined by the president of the American Federation of Teachers in a discussion about what it'll take for schools to safely reopen this fall in the US. And that's Monday at 10:15 a.m. Eastern Time on Monday, August 16th. So be sure to tune into that. And thank you all again for tuning in. I hope you are safe and well wherever you are. Obviously, the pandemic morphs and shifts. So make sure you follow your local health guidelines, because you could only get hired and you could only be a good candidate if you're healthy and well enough to do so. So until Friday, I'm so happy that you were here, and best of luck with your job search and your career.